Cosmology in Modern Science by Titus Burckhardt, Part 5. The object of psychology is the psychic. Unfortunately, it is also its subject. Thus wrote a famous psychologist of our time. According to this opinion, every psychological judgment inevitably participates in the essentially subjective, not to say passionate and tendentious, nature of its object. For according to this logic, no one understands the soul except by means of his own soul, and the latter, for the psychologist, precisely belongs only to the psychic and to nothing else. No psychologist, whatever may be his claim to objectivity, can escape from this dilemma, and the more categorical and general are his affirmations in this realm, the more they will be suspect. Such is the verdict that modern psychology pronounces in its own cause, when it is sincere toward itself. Whether it is so or not, the relativism expressed by the aforementioned sentence is inherent in it. This relativism is also a kind of Prometheism that would make of the psychic the ultimate reality of man. It is the root of the manifold divergencies that have arisen in the interior of this discipline, and it dominates it to the point of contaminating whatever that discipline touches. At its contact, history, philosophy, art, and religion all become psychological in turn, and therefore also subjective, that is to say, devoid of objective and immutable certainties. But all relativism, laid down a priori, is inconsistent with itself. Despite the admitted precariousness of its viewpoint, modern psychology behaves like every other science. It utters judgments and believes in their validity, and in this respect it leans unknowingly or without admitting the fact on an innate certitude. In effect, if we are able to observe that the psychic is subjective, that is to say, dominated by a certain egocentric bias, imposing on it certain limits or a particular color, this is because there is to be found in us something that is not subject to the same limits or tendencies, but exceeds and dominates them in principle. That something is the intellect. And this it is that normally provides us with the criteria whereby the fluctuating and uncertain world of the psyche can alone be illuminated. Though the evidence for this speaks for itself, it remains totally outside modern scientific and philosophical thinking. It is important, above all, not to confuse intellect and reason. The latter is indeed the mental reflection of the transcendent intellect, but in practice it is only what one makes of it, by which is meant that its functioning is limited, in the case of the modern sciences, by the empirical method itself. At the level of the latter, reason is not so much a source of truth as a principle of coherence. For modern psychology, it is even less than that. For if scientific rationalism lends a relatively stable framework to one's observation of the physical world, it reveals itself as entirely insufficient when it comes to describing the world of the soul. Hardly can psychic movements at the surface, namely those whose cause and aims are situated on the plane of current experience, be translated into rational terms. All the chaos of inferior and mostly unconscious psychic possibilities escapes rationality, and this is even more true of whatever stands above the rational, which means that the greater part of the psychic world on the one hand and the metaphysical realm on the other will appear irrational according to this measure of thought. Hence a certain tendency inherent in modern psychology to relativize reason itself, which is a self-contradictory tendency, since psychology could not dispense with rational methods. Psychology finds itself facing a domain that overflows in all directions, the horizon of a science built on empiricism and the Cartesian standpoint. For this reason, the majority of modern psychologists ensconce themselves in a sort of pragmatism. It is in a committed experience, coupled with a coldly clinical attitude, that they see some guarantee of objectivity. In point of fact, the movements of the soul cannot be studied from the outside, as in the case of bodily phenomena, In order to know what they signify, they have in a sense to be lived, and this raises the question of the observer himself, as was justly pointed out by the psychologist we quoted at the outset. As for the mental faculty that controls the experiment, what is this but a common sense of a more or less arbitrary kind, one that is inevitably colored by preconceived ideas? The would-be objectivist psychic attitude therefore changes nothing in regard to the uncertain nature of the experiment, and thus one returns, failingly a principle at once interior and immutable, to the dilemma of the psychic striving to grasp the psychic. The soul, like any other compartment of reality, can only be truly known by that which exceeds it. This is admitted spontaneously and implicitly when people recognize the moral principle of justice, which demands that men should overcome their individual subjectivity. Now, it would be impossible for a man to overcome it if the intelligence which guides his will were itself nothing but his psychic reality, and intelligence would not exceed the psyche if in its essence it did not transcend the plane of phenomena, both internal and external. This observation suffices to prove the necessity and the existence of a psychology deriving in some sense from above, and not claiming on a priori empirical character. But although this order of things is inscribed in our very nature, it will never be admitted by modern psychology. Despite its own reactions against the rationalism of yesterday, it stands no nearer to metaphysics than any other empirical science. Indeed, quite the contrary, for its perspective, which assimilates the supra-rational to the irrational, predisposes it to the worst of errors. What modern psychology lacks entirely is criteria allowing it to situate the aspects or tendencies of the soul in their cosmic context. In traditional psychology, these criteria are provided according to two principal dimensions, namely, on the one hand, according to a cosmology that situates the soul and its modalities in the hierarchy of states of existence, and on the other hand, according to a morality directed toward a spiritual aim. The latter can provisionally espouse the individual horizon. It nonetheless keeps in view the universal principles attaching the soul to an order more vast than itself. Cosmology, in some senses, circumscribes the soul. Spiritual morality plumbs its depths. Just as a current of water reveals its force and direction only when it breaks against an object that resists it, so the soul can show its tendencies and fluctuations only in relation to an immutable principle. Whoever wishes to know the nature of the psyche must resist it, and one only resists truly when one places oneself, if not effectively, then at least virtually or symbolically, at a point corresponding to the divine self or to the intellect which is like its ray. Traditional psychology has therefore one impersonal and one static dimension, namely cosmology, and the other personal and operative dimension, namely morality, or the science of the virtues, and this is necessarily the case because the genuine knowledge of the soul results from the knowledge of oneself. He who, by the eye of his essence, is able to objectivize his own psychic form, by that very fact knows all the possibilities of the psychic or subtle world. It is this intellectual vision that is both the outcome and, if need, the guarantor of every sacred science of the soul. For the majority of modern psychologists, the traditional morality, which they readily confuse with a purely social or conventional morality, is nothing but a kind of psychic dam, useful on occasion, but more often a hindrance or even harmful for the normal development of the individual. This opinion is especially propagated by the Freudian psychoanalysis, now become of very general application in certain countries, where it has practically usurped the function that elsewhere belongs to the sacrament of the confession. The psychiatrist replaces the priest, and the bursting of the complexes that had previously been repressed takes the place of absolution. In ritual confession, the priest is but the impersonal representative, necessarily discrete, of the truth that judges and pardons. The penitent, by admitting his sins, objectivizes, in some sense, the psychic tendencies these sins manifest. By repenting, he detaches himself from them, and by receiving the sacramental absolution, his soul is virtually reintegrated in its primitive equilibrium and centered on its divine essence. In the case of the Freudian psychoanalysis, on the other hand, man lays bare his psychic entrails, not before God, but to his fellow. He does not draw away from the chaotic and obscure depths of his soul, which the analysis unveils or stirs, but on the contrary, he assumes them, for he must say to himself, "So I am in reality." And if he does not overcome, with the help of some salutary instinct, this kind of dissolution from below, he will keep from it something like an intimate sullying. In most cases, it will be his self-abandonment to the collective mediocrity that for him will play the part of an absolution, for it is easier to endure one's own degradation when this is shared with others. Whatever may be the occasional and partial usefulness of such an analysis in certain cases, the state described above is its more usual result, given that its premises are what they are. If the medicine of the traditional civilizations knows nothing analogous to modern psychotherapy, this is because the psychic cannot be treated by means of the psychic. The psyche is the realm of indefinite actions and reactions. By its own specific nature, it is essentially unstable and deceptive, so that it can be cured only by resorting to something situated outside and above it. In some cases, one will act favorably upon it by reestablishing the humoral balance of the body, commonly upset by psychic affections. In other cases, it is only by the use of spiritual means, such as exorcism, prayer, or a sojourn in holy places, that the soul can be restored to health. We are all aware of the fact that modern psychology tries to explain in a psychological sense the spiritual means mentioned above. In its eyes, the effect of a rite is one thing, and its theological or mystical interpretation is another. The effect of the rite, arbitrarily limited to the psychic and subjective domain only, is attributed to psychic dispositions of ancestral origin, which its form is supposed to actualize. There is no question of a timeless and superhuman sense inherent in the rite or symbol, as if the soul could cure itself through believing in the illusory projection of its own preoccupations, whether individual or collective. There is nothing in the above supposition to shock modern psychology, since the latter goes much farther than this in admitting, for example, that the fundamental forms of thought, the laws of logic, merely represent a residue of ancestral habits. This path is one that leads to the outright denial of intelligence and to its replacement by biological fatalities, if indeed psychology can go that far without encompassing its own ruin. In order to be able to situate the soul in relation to other cosmic realities or realms, one must refer to the cosmological scheme where the degrees of existence are represented under the forms of circles or concentric spheres. This scheme, which amplifies the geocentric conception of the visible universe, identifies the corporeal world symbolically with our terrestrial surroundings. Around this region there extends the sphere or spheres of the subtle or psychic world, enclosed in their turn by the sphere of the world of pure spirit. This representation is naturally limited by its own spatial character, yet at the same time it well expresses the relation existing between these various states. Each of these spheres, considered in itself, is presented as a complete and perfectly homogeneous whole, whereas from the viewpoint of the sphere immediately superior to it, it is but a content thereof. Thus the corporeal world, envisaged at its own level, knows not the subtle world, just as the latter knows not the supraformal world, precisely because it only includes that which has a form. Furthermore, each of these worlds is known and dominated by that which exceeds and enfolds it. It is from the immutable and formless background of the spirit that the subtle realities become detached as forms, and it is the soul that through its sensory faculties knows the corporeal. This double relationship of things, which hides itself a priori from our individual vision, can be grasped alive when one considers the very nature of sensible perception. On the one hand, this really reaches the corporeal world, and no philosophic artifice will be able to convince us of the contrary. On the other hand, there is no doubt that all we perceive of the world are but those images of it that our mental faculty is able to keep hold of, and in this respect the whole fabric made of impressions, memories, and expectations, in short, all that for us constitutes the sensible continuity and logical coherence of the world, is of a psychic or subtle nature. It is in vain that one will try to know what the world is outside this subtle continuity, since the corporeal world is but a content thereof, even while appearing, when viewed in the mirror of that state, as a materially autonomous order. It is evidently not the individual soul, but the entire subtle order that contains the physical world. The logical coherence of the latter implies the unity of the former, as manifested indirectly by the fact that the multiple individual visions of the sensible world, fragmentary as they are, coincide in substance and are integrated in one continuous whole. The individual soul participates in this unity, both by the structure of its cognitive faculties, in conformity with the cosmic order, and also by its nature as a subject containing the physical world in its own way. Otherwise regarded, the physical world is a world only in relation to the individual subject, in virtue of the cleaving of consciousness into object and subject, a cleaving that results precisely from the egoic polarization of the soul. By this same polarization, the soul is distinguished from the totality of the subtle state, the universal or total soul of Plotinus, without, however, being substantially separated from it. For if it were so separated, our vision of the world would not be adequate to reality. Now it is adequate, in spite of the limitations and relativity of all perception. It is true that ordinarily we perceive only an isolated fragment of the subtle world, the fragment that we are, and that constitutes our myself, whereas the sensible world reveals itself to us in its macrocosmic continuity, as a whole that seems to include us. The reason is that the subtle world is the very field of individuation. In reality, we are steeped in the ocean of the subtle world as fishes are in the water, and like them, we do not see that which constitutes our own element. As for the opposition between the psychic world as internal and the corporeal world as external, this becomes actualized only in relation to and in function of the latter. In itself, the subtle world is neither internal nor external. At most, it is non-external, whereas the corporeal world is external as such, which furthermore proves that it does not enjoy an autonomous existence. The corporeal state and the psychic state both form part of the formal existence. In its total extension, the subtle state is none other than formal existence, but we call it subtle insofar as it escapes the laws of corporeity. According to one of the most ancient and natural symbolisms, the subtle state may be compared to the atmosphere surrounding the earth and pervading all porous bodies and acting as a vehicle of life. A phenomenon of whatever kind can only be truly understood through its relations, both horizontal and vertical, with total reality. This truth applies in a particular and in a certain sense practical manner to psychic phenomenon. A self-same psychic event can simultaneously occur in answer to a sensory impulsion, to the manifestation of a wish as a consequence of an interior action, or it can appear as the trace of the typical and ancestral form of the individual, as the expression of his genius, or again, as the reflection of a supra-individual reality. It is legitimate to consider this psychic phenomenon in question under one or other of these aspects, but on the other hand, it would be abusive to try and explain the notions and motives of the soul by a single one, or by several of these aspects exclusively. In this respect, let us quote the words of a psychiatrist who has shown himself to be well aware of the limits of contemporary psychology. There is an ancient saying of the Hindus, the psychological truth of which can hardly be contested. What a man thinks, that he becomes. If one steadfastly thinks of good deeds, one will end by becoming a good man. If one always thinks of weakness, one will be weak. If one thinks of how to develop one's strength, body or mental, one will become strong. Similarly, if for years one is almost daily engaged in stirring up Hades, explaining systematically everything higher in terms of the lower, ignoring at the same time all that in mankind's cultural history, in spite of its lamentable errors and misdeeds, has been regarded as valuable, the danger can scarcely be averted that discrimination will be lost. Imagination, a fountain of life, will be leveled down, and the mental horizon will shrink. Ordinary consciousness serves to eliminate only a restricted portion of the individual soul, and the latter represents but a minimal part of the psychic world. Nevertheless, the soul is not isolated from the remainder of that world. Its situation is not that of a body rigorously limited by its own special extension and separated from other bodies. That which distinguishes the soul from the aggregate of the vast subtle world is solely its own particular tendencies, whereby it is defined, to employ a very simplified image, as a given spatial direction defines the ray of light that follows it. By those same tendencies, the soul is in communion with all the cosmic possibilities pertaining to analogous tendencies or qualities. It assimilates them and is assimilated to them. For this reason, the science of cosmic tendencies, the gunas of Hindu cosmology, is fundamental for the knowledge of the soul. In this order of ideas, it is not the external context of a psychic phenomenon, the accidental occasion for its manifestation, that matters essentially, but its connection with sattva, rajas, or tamas, the upward, expansive, and downward tendencies, which confers its rank on that phenomenon in the hierarchy of internal values. The motives of the soul being perceptible only across the forms that manifest them, it is on these forms or manifestations that a psychological assessment must needs be founded. Now, the part played by the gunas in any form whatsoever can be measured only in a purely qualitative manner. Therefore, in reference to precise and decisive, and in no wise quantitative, criteria such as are entirely lacking in the quite profane psychology of our time. There are some psychic events whose repercussions traverse all the degrees of the subtle world vertically, since they touch the essences. Others, these are the ordinary psychic movements, only obey the horizontal coming and going of the psyche. Lastly, there are those that derive from the subhuman depths. The first of these do not lend themselves entirely to expression. They include an element of mystery, and yet the forms they evoke occasionally in the imagination are clear and precise, such as those characterizing the true sacred arts. The third kind, the demoniac inspirations, are unintelligible by their very forms. They ape true mystery by the nebulous, obscure, and equivocal character of their formal manifestations, of which examples can easily be found in contemporary art. When studying the formal manifestations of the soul, one must, however, not forget that the psychophysical organism of man can display strange, caesarious, or discontinuities. Thus, for instance, in the case of certain states of the soul as found among that somewhat anarchical category of contemplatives known as fools in God, the spiritual states in question are hardly being manifested normally and harmoniously, and do not make use of the reason. Inversely, an intrinsically pathological state, dominated as such by infrahuman and chaotic tendencies, may incidentally and by accident comprise openings towards supra-terrestrial realities. This is but saying that the human soul is of an unplumbed complexity. Viewed as a whole, the subtle world is incomparably vaster and more varied than the corporeal world. Dante expresses this by making the entire hierarchy of planetary spheres correspond to the subtle world and only the earthly surroundings to the corporeal. The subterranean position of the hells in his system merely indicates that the states in question are situated below the normal human state. In reality, these likewise form part of the subtle state, and it is for this reason that certain medieval cosmologists place the hells symbolically between heaven and earth. Experience of the subtle world is subjective, except in the case of certain sciences quite unknown to the moderns, because consciousness, in identifying itself with subtle forms, is affected by their tendencies, just as a light is turned from its course by the form of a wave that it happens to traverse. The subtle world is made up of forms, that is to say, it comprises diversity and contrast, but these forms do not possess, in themselves and outside their projections in sensible imagination, spatial and defined contours, as in the case of corporeal forms. They are entirely active, or to be more exact, dynamic, since pure activity belongs only to the essential forms, or archetypes, which are to be found in the world of pure spirit. Now the ego, or individual soul, is itself one of the forms of the subtle world, so that the consciousness that espouses this form is necessarily dynamic and exclusive. It realizes other subtle forms only insofar as these become modalities of its own egoic form. Thus, it is that in the dream state, individual consciousness, even while being reabsorbed in the subtle world, nonetheless remains turned back on itself. All the forms it lives while in that state present themselves as simple prolongations of the individual subject, or at least they appear so in retrospect, and inasmuch as they verge on the state of wakefulness. For in itself, and despite this subjectivism, the consciousness of the dreamer is evidently not impermeable by influences originating from the most diverse regions of the subtle world, as is proved, among other things, by premonitory or telepathic dreams, such as has been experienced by many people. In truth, if the imagery of dream is woven from the very substance of the subject, a substance that is none other than the progressive actualization of his own psychic form, it nonetheless manifests incidentally and at varying degrees realities of a cosmic order. The contents of a dream can be considered under several relationships. If one analyzes the materia of which it is made, one will find that it is constituted by all sorts of memories, and in this respect the current psychological explanation, making of the dream an expression of subconscious residues, is largely right. It is not, however, excluded that a dream might also comprise materials that in no wise proceed from the personal experience of the dreamer, and that are like traces of a psychic transfusion from one individual to another. There is also question of the economy of the dream, and in this respect one may quote the following description of C.G. Jung, which is exact despite the radically false thesis of that author. The dream, deriving from the activity of the unconscious, gives a representation of the contents that slumber there. Not all of the contents that figure in it, but only of certain ones among them which, by way of association, are actualized, crystallized, and selected in correlation with a momentary state of the consciousness. As for the hermeneutic science of dreams, this eludes modern psychology in spite of its efforts in this direction, for it would not be possible to interpret validly the images reflected by the soul without knowing to what level of reality these refer. The images one retains on waking from a dream generally represent only a shadow of that which the psychic form one lived in the state of dream amounted to in itself. At the time of passage to the state of wakefulness, a sort of decantation takes place, of which one can, however, take note, in so far as something of the reality inherent in the dream evaporates more or less rapidly. There exists, nevertheless, a certain category of dreams, well known to the traditional oneirocritic science, the remembrance of which persists with incisive clearness, and this can happen even if the profound contents of these dreams appears to conceal itself. Such dreams, which most often occur at dawn and which finally lead to awakening, are accompanied by an irrefutable feeling of objectivity. Otherwise put, they comprise a more than merely mental certainty. But that which characterizes them above all and independently of their moral influence on the dreamer is the high quality of their forms, disengaged from every kind of turbid or chaotic residue. These are the dreams that come from the angel, that is to say, from the essence connecting the soul with the supraformal states of the being. Since there are dreams of divine or angelic inspiration, there must also exist their contrary, namely dreams of satanic impulsion, containing palpable caricatures of sacred forms. The sensation accompanying them will not be made of cool and serene lucidity, but of obsession and vertigo, such is the attraction exerted by the abyss. The infernal influences sometimes ride on the wave of a natural passion, which opens a way for them, so to speak. They are, however, distinguishable from the elementary character of passion by their arrogantly negative tendency, accompanied either by bitterness or by sadness. He who tries to play the angel will play the beast, said Pascal, and in effect nothing is so apt to provoke caricatures, both in dreaming and elsewhere, as the unconsciously pretentious attitude of the man who mixes God with his own highly particularized ego, the classical motive of many of the psychoses studied and exploited by the post-Freudian psychologism. It was starting from the analysis of dreams that C.G. Jung developed his famous theory about the collective unconscious. Observation of the fact that a certain category of dream images cannot be explained simply in terms of residues from individual experiences led Jung to distinguish within the unconscious domain whence dreams are fed between a personal zone whose contents, after all, represent the other face of individual psychic life, and a collective zone made up of latent psychic dispositions of an impersonal character, such as never offer themselves to the direct grasp of the consciousness, but manifest themselves indirectly through symbolic dreams and irrational impulsions. At first sight, this theory has nothing extravagant about it, except its use of the term irrational in connection with symbolism. It is easy to understand that the individual consciousness centered on the empirical ego leaves on its margin or even outside itself all that which, in the psychic order is not effectively attached to the center, just as a light projected in a given direction decreases towards the surrounding darkness. But this is not how Jung understands the matter. For him, the non-personal zone of the soul is unconscious as such. That is to say, its contents can never become a direct object of the intelligence, whatever its modality or however great its extension may be. Just as the human body displays a common anatomy, independently of racial differences, so also the psyche possesses, beyond all cultural and mental differences, a common substratum that I have named the collective unconscious. This unconscious psyche, which is common to all men, is not made up of contents able to become conscious, but solely of latent dispositions giving rise to certain reactions that are always identical. The author goes on from here to insinuate that here one has finally to do with ancestral structures having their root in the physical order. The fact that this collective unconscious exists is simply the psychic expression of the identity of cerebral structures beyond all racial differences. The different lines of psychic evolution start out from one and the same trunk, of which the roots plunge through all the ages. It is here that the psychic parallelism with the animal is situated. One notices the plainly Darwinian turn of this thesis, of which the disastrous consequences in the intellectual and spiritual order announce themselves in the following passage. It is this which explains the analogy and indeed the identity of mythological motives and of symbols as means of human communication in general. Myths and symbols would therefore be the expression of an ancestral psychic fund that brings man near to the animal. These have no intellectual or spiritual foundation, since, from a purely psychological viewpoint, it is a matter of common instincts of imagining and acting. All conscious imagination and action has evolved on the basis of these unconscious prototypes and remains constantly attached to them, and this is especially the case when consciousness has not yet attained a very high degree of lucidity, that is to say, as long as it is still, in all its functions, more dependent on instinct than on conscious will, as long as it is more effective than rational. This above passage clearly shows that, for Jung, the collective unconscious is situated below at the level of psychological instincts. It is important to bear this in mind, since the term collective unconscious in itself could carry a wider and in some sort more spiritual meaning, as certain assimilations made by Jung seem to suggest, especially his utilizing, or rather in point of fact, his usurping of the term archetype, in order to indicate the latent and, as such, inaccessible contents of the collective unconscious. For though the archetypes do not belong to the psychic realm, but to the world of pure spirit, they nevertheless are reflected at the psychic level, as virtualities of images in the first place, before becoming crystallized according to circumstances, and images properly so called, so that a certain psychological application of the term archetypes could at a pinch be justified. But here it is that Jung defines an archetype as an innate complex and describes its action on the soul. Possession by an archetype makes of man a purely collective personage, a kind of mask under which human nature can no longer develop but degenerates progressively. As if an archetype, which is an immediate and superformal determination of being, and non-limitative by that very fact, could in any sense cast a spell on and vampirize the soul. What is really in question in the more or less pathological case envisaged by Jung It is simply a question of a dissociation of the possibilities inherent in the subtle form of man, a form that includes multiple aspects, each of which has something unique and irreplaceable about it. In every non-degenerate human individual there is to be found in potency a man and a woman, a father and a mother, a child and an elderly person, as various qualities or dignities inseparable from the original and ontological position of man, such as the priestly and royal qualities and those of creative artisan, a servant, and so forth. Normally, all these possibilities complete one another. Here, there is no question of an irrational fund of the soul, for the coexistence of these diverse possibilities or aspects of the human form is perfectly intelligible in itself and can be hidden only from the eyes of a mentality or civilization that has become one-sided and false. Every genial development of one of these multiple possibilities or dispositions inherent in the human soul, moreover, requires the integration of the complementary possibilities. The true man of genius is a balanced being, for where there is no balance, there is no greatness either. The contrary of such a development is the barren and pathological exaggeration of one of the soul's possibilities in disregard and at the cost of the others, leading to that kind of moral caricature compared by Young to a mask. And let it be added that it is the carnivalesque mask one must think of here, and not the sacred mask, which, for its part, precisely does express a true archetype, and therefore a possibility that does not bewitch the soul, but on the contrary, liberates it. Psychic dissociation always produces a fixation as well as tearing apart between opposing poles, and this is rendered possible only by the clouding over of that which, in the soul, corresponds to the archetype. At the antipodes of this imbalance, productive of hypertrophies, perfect virility, for example, in no wise excludes femininity, but on the contrary includes and adapts it, and the same is true of the opposite case. Similarly, the genuine archetypes, which are not situated at the psychic level, do not mutually exclude, but comprise and imply one another. According to the Platonic and hallowed meaning of the term, the archetypes are sources of being and knowledge, and not, as Young conceives them, unconscious dispositions toward acting and imaging. The fact that the archetypes cannot be grasped by discursive thought has no connection with the irrational and obscure character of the supposed collective unconscious, whose contents could be known indirectly only through their eruptions on the surface. There is not only discursive thought, but also intellectual intuition, and it is the latter that attains to the archetypes starting out from their symbols. Doubtless, the theory according to which ancestral structures constitute the collective unconscious imposes itself all the more easily on the most modern thinking, inasmuch as it seems to be in agreement with the evolutionist explanation of the instinct of animals. According to this view, instinct would be the expression of the heredity of a species, of an accumulation of analogous experiences down the ages. Thus, it is that they explain, for instance, the fact that a flock of sheep hastily gathers together around the lambs the moment it perceives the shadow of a bird of prey, or that a kitten, while playing, already employs all the tricks of a hunter, or that birds know how to build their nests. In reality, it is enough to watch animals in order to see that their instinct has nothing of an automatism in it. The formation for such a mechanism by a purely cumulative and consequently vague and accidental process is, moreover, something highly improbable, to say the least. Instinct is a non-reflective modality of intelligence. It is determined not by a series of automatic reflexes, but by the form, the qualitative determination of the species. This form is like a filter through which the universal intelligence is manifested. Nor must it be forgotten that the subtle form of a being is incompatibly more complex than its bodily form. The same thing holds for man too, by which is meant that his intelligence also is determined by the subtle form of his species. This form, however, includes the reflective faculty, which allows of a singularization of the individual such as does not exist among the animals. Man alone is able to objectivize himself. He can say, I am this or that. He alone possesses this two-edged faculty. Man, by virtue of his own central position in the cosmos, is able to exceed his specific norm. He is also able to betray it and sink lower. Corruptio optimi pessima. A normal animal remains true to the form and genius of its species. If its intelligence is not reflective and objectifying, but in some sort existential, it is nonetheless spontaneous. It is assuredly a form of the universal intelligence, even if it be not recognized as such by some men who, from prejudice or ignorance, identify intelligence with discursive thought exclusively. As for Jung's thesis that certain dreams, which cannot be explained as personal reminiscences and which seem to arise from an unconscious fund common to all men, contain motives and forms that are also to be found in myths and in traditional symbolism, the thing is possible in principle. Not that there is in the soul a repertory of types inherited from distant ancestors and witnessing to a primitive vision of the world, but because true symbols are always actual inasmuch as they express non-temporal realities. In fact, under certain conditions, the soul is able to take on the function of a mirror that reflects, in a purely passive and imaginative manner, universal truths contained in the intellect. Nevertheless, inspirations of this nature remain fairly rare. They depend on circumstances that are, so to speak, providential, as in the case of dreams communicating truths or announcing future events, to which allusion has previously been made. Moreover, symbolic dreams are not clothed in just any traditional style. Their formal language is normally determined by the tradition or religion to which the individual is effectively or virtually attached, for nothing arbitrary is to be found in this domain. Now, if one examines examples of supposedly symbolical dreams, as quoted by Jung or by other psychologists of his school, one notices that in most cases it is a matter of false symbolism, of the kind commonly met with in pseudo-spiritual circles. The soul is not only a sacred mirror, more often it is a magic mirror that deceives him who views himself in it. Jung should have known this, since he himself speaks of the tricks of the anima, indicating by this term the feminine aspect of the soul, and in some of his own experiences, as described in his memoirs, should have told him that an investigator of the unconscious depths of the psyche exposes himself not merely to the wiles of the egocentric soul, but also to the psychic influences coming from elsewhere, from unknown beings and entities, especially when the methods of analysis used derive from hypnosis or mediumship. It is in this context that must be placed certain designs executed by sick patients of Jung, in which the latter tries to palm off as genuine mandalas. On another side, there exists a symbolism of very general character and underlying language itself, as for instance when one compares truth to light and error to darkness, or a progress to an ascent and a moral danger to an abyss, or when one represents fidelity by a dog or craftiness by a fox. Now, to explain the occurrence of a similar symbolism in dreams, of which the language is naturally figurative and not discursive, there is no need to refer to a collective unconscious. It is enough to note that rational thought is not the whole of thought, in that the consciousness in the waking state does not cover the whole region of mental activity. If the figurative language of dreams is not discursive, this does not necessarily make it rational, and it is possible, as indeed Jung has properly observed, that a dreamer shows himself more intelligent during his dreams than in his waking state. It would even seem as if this difference of levels as between these two states is fairly frequent among men of our own time, doubtless because the frameworks imposed by modern life are particularly unintelligent and incapable of conveying in a normal way the essential contents of human life. This has evidently nothing to do with the function of purely symbolic or sacred dreams, whether these be spontaneous or evoked through rites. Here one is thinking of the example of the Indians of North America, whose whole tradition, as well as their vital ambience, favors a kind of dream-nourished prophetism. In order to neglect no aspect of this question, the following may be added. In every collectivity that has become unfaithful to its own traditional form, to the sacred framework of its life, there ensues a collapse or a sort of mummification of the symbols it had received, and this process will be reflected in the psychic life of every individual belonging to that collectivity and participating in that infidelity. To every truth there corresponds a formal trace, and every spiritual form projects a psychic shadow. When these shadows are all that remain, they do in fact take on the character of ancestral phantoms that haunt the subconscious. The most pernicious of psychological errors is to reduce the meaning of symbolism to such phantoms. As for the definition of unconscious, it must never be forgotten that this is eminently relative and provisional. Consciousness is capable of gradation like light, and is similarly refracted in conformity with the media it meets. The ego is the form of individual consciousness. It could not be its luminous source. The latter coincides with the very source of intelligence. In its universal nature, consciousness is in a sense an existential aspect of the intellect, and this comes down to saying that nothing is basically situated outside it. Whence it follows that the unconscious of the psychologist is merely all that, in the soul, lies outside ordinary consciousness, that of the empirical I, orientated toward the corporeal world. That is to say, this unconscious is made to include at the same time the inferior chaos and the superior states. The latter, which Hindus compare to the bliss of deep sleep, the state of prajna, emanate from the luminous source of universal spirit. The definition of unconscious, therefore, in no wise delimits a given concrete modality of the soul. Many of the errors of depth psychology, whereof Jung is one of the chief protagonists, spring from the fact that it operates with the unconscious as if with a definite entity. One often hears it said that Jung's psychology has re-established the autonomous reality of the soul. In truth, according to the inherent perspective of this psychology, the soul is neither independent nor immortal. It is merely a kind of irrational fatality situated outside any intelligible cosmic order. If the moral and mental behavior of man were secretly determined by a collection of ancestral types issuing from a fund that is entirely unconscious and entirely inaccessible to the intelligence, man would be as if suspended between two irreconcilable and divergent realities, namely that of things and that of the soul. For all modern psychology, the luminous pinnacle of the soul, or its existential summit, is its consciousness of the I, which evolves in such measure as it is able to disengage itself from the darkness of the unconscious. Now, according to Jung, this darkness contains the vital roots of the individuality. The collective unconscious would then be endowed with a regulatory instinct, a kind of somnambulant wisdom of a biological nature, doubtless. From this fact, the conscious emancipation of the ego would compromise the danger of a vital uprooting. According to Jung, the ideal is a balance between the two poles of the conscious and the unconscious, one that can be realized only by the help of a third term, a sort of center of crystallization which he calls the self, this term being borrowed from the doctrines of India. Here is what he has written on the subject. With the sensation of the self as an irrational and indefinable entity, to which the I is neither opposed nor subordinated, but to which it adheres and round which it evolves in some sort, like the earth going round the sun, the aim of individuation is attained. I use this term sensation to express thereby the empirical character of the relation between I and self. In this relation, there is nothing intelligible, for one can say nothing about the contents of the self. The I is the only content of the self we know. The individualized I feels itself to be the object of another subject, unknown and superior to itself. It seems to me that psychological observation here touches its extreme limit, which one can certainly justify psychologically, but could not prove satisfactorily. The step beyond science is an absolute requirement of the psychological evolution described here, for without the postulate in question, I could not formulate sufficiently the psychic processes established by experience. From this fact, the idea of a self possesses at least the value of a hypothesis after the likeness of the theories about the structure of the atom. And if it be true that here also we are prisoners of an image, this is in any case an eminently living image, the interpretation of which exceeds my capabilities. I scarcely doubt that it is a case of an image, but of an image which contains us. Despite a terminology too much bound up with the current scientism, one might be tempted to grant full credit to the presentiments expressed in the above passage, and to find in it an approach to the traditional metaphysical doctrines if Jung, in a second passage, did not relativize the notion of the self by treating it this time not as a transcendent principle, but as the outcome of a psychological process. One could define the self as a sort of compensation in reference to the contrast between interior and exterior. Such a definition could well be applied to the self insofar as the latter possesses the character of a result, of an aim to reach, of a thing that only was produced little by little, and of which the experience has cost much travail. Thus, the self is also the aim of life, for it is the most complete expression of that combination of destiny we call an individual, and not only of man in the singular, but also of a whole group, where the one is the complement of the others in view of a perfect image. There are some realms where dilettantism is unforgivable. It is the balance to be realized between the conscious and the unconscious, or the integration and the empirical personality of certain forces or impulsions emanating from the unconscious, that Jung paradoxically labels as individuation, using a term by which was traditionally designated not some psychological process or other, but the differentiation of individuals starting from the species. That which Jung understands thereby is a kind of definitive pronunciation of the individuality which is taken as an end in itself. In such a perspective, the notion of self plainly loses all metaphysical meaning, but this is not the only traditional notion that Jung appropriates in order to debase it to a purely psychological and even clinical level. Thus, he compares psychoanalysis, which he uses precisely to promote this individuation, to an initiation in the proper and sacred meaning of the term, and he even declares that psychoanalysis represents the only form of initiation still valid in the modern age. Whence proceed a whole series of false assimilations and intrusions into a realm where psychology is devoid of competence. Here it is not a case of the involuntary ignorance of some isolated seeker, for Jung carefully avoided all contact with the representatives of living tradition. During his travels in India, for example, he did not wish to see Sri Ramana Maharishi, alleging a motive of insolent frivolity, doubtless because he feared instinctively and unconsciously, it is a case for saying it, a contact with a reality that would disprove his own theories. For him, metaphysics was but a speculation in the void, or, to be more exact, an illusory attempt of the psychic to reach beyond itself, comparable to the senseless gesture of a man who tries to pull himself out of a mud hole by his own hair. This conception is typical of modern psychology, and this is why it is mentioned here. To the absurd argument that metaphysics is only a production of the psyche, one could easily object that the above-mentioned judgment itself is but a similar production. Man lives by truth. To admit any truth whatsoever, however relative this may be, is to admit that intellectus adequatio re. To say this and that is to affirm at the same time the very principle of adequation, therefore the presence of the absolute in the relative. Jung breached certain strictly materialistic frameworks of modern science, but this fact is of no use to anyone, to say the least. One would have liked to rejoice over it, because the influences that infiltrate through this breach come from the inferior psychism and not from the spirit, which alone is true and alone is able to save us.